Hey everyone, welcome back to Woody's Workshop. Today I'm going to be showing you how to replace the valve stem seals on a N62 V8 in an X5. My previous video I showed you how to do the valley pan gasket. Obviously I haven't put it all back together yet. It kind of makes more sense to do the valve stem seals with the intake still out. So I'm going to show you just kind of a quick tear down of the valve covers. I'm not going to show a step-by-step on the valve cover job or the timing covers, because honestly if you're getting into the valve stem seals, hopefully you know how to take the valve covers off and every timing covers and all that. I will show you how to time it and how to pull the cams out, and a little more in-depth kind of complex repair. This isn't really it's not really a do-it-yourselfer type of job. You kind of have to know what you're doing. If you make a mistake when you're doing this, it could be catastrophic and could get very expensive very quickly. So this is kind of a more advanced tutorial, but I figured I would record it and show you what it takes. And if you feel like tackling it, it's definitely a little more complex, but it can be done. So with all that being said, let's get right into it. Alright, so I've got my valve covers off and my timing covers off. I chose to just plop all the harness and everything right in the valley of the engine. Normally you'd have your intake on, so you'd kind of have everything pulled off to the side, and you just have to kind of work around it. Some of the this valve covers can be kind of challenging to get out. You've really got to work around these heater lines and just be very careful when you're removing these valve covers. These eccentric shaft sensors are really prone to just snapping off if you're not cautious. You really got to be mindful of those. So now that I'm at this point, I've already timed this engine and put it in TDC. So the crankshaft is a 27 millimeter, and there is a crank pin right, you can't really see it right there. So that pin is indexed on the harmonic balancer, and it lines up with a hole in the front timing cover. Once you have your intake cams, which you can tell with these two dots, and your exhaust cams with those two lines, once you have those both pointing up and your hole lines up on your harmonic balancer, you slide in that crank pin. And if you want to just double check it, these are the cam blocks for the N62. The intake always has the hole. That's if you got a Chinese kit or if you got the actual BMW tools. Either way, it's still going to have that hole. One thing I didn't mention is the crank pin. This is like a Chinese timing kit that I'm using, and a lot of times with those kits, the crank pins are not the right diameter right out of the box. So I did have to put it on the grinding wheel just a little bit to get it to line up. But you can double check. There you go. There's your intake. See, it's sitting flush against the head. So At this point, I'm ready to take my intake camshaft bolts out. No, not my intake camshaft bolts, but both my camshaft bolts out. You do have to take off this top rail tensioner, which will also come out with this oil feed line. This oil feed line or drip line or whatever you want to call it, you just got to be really patient when you're clipping it off. It's just got these little metal clips that hold it in place, and if you go in here like a barbarian and start pulling on this and yanking on this, you're going to bend this pipe. Okay, I've got my cams out on my passenger side. Now you can see I've got pretty much direct access to my valve stems, or my valve stem seals, or my valves, whatever you want to say, valve springs. So I'll have enough room here to fit my universal spring compressor tool. What I like to do, I still have the driver's side, I still have to take apart, but what I like to do is undo both the drivers and the passenger side motor mounts, and I actually use a you can use a floor jack to raise the engine and kind of push it to one side or the other to give you more clearance. What I usually use is just a A-frame hoist, and I'll slide it around the front tires and pull the engine either direction, either from this front hook or from the rear hook there, depending on which side I'm working on. It gives you that little bit more clearance and visibility when you're doing the seals. So it's been a couple days. I'm back in the shop today, and as you can see, I've got my cams out on both cylinder heads. I've got my universal valve spring compressor jig here. This is just like an OTC tool. It's a fairly cheap tool. I think it's maybe $100. And you do have to shift around the bridges depending on what valves you're trying to get to, just for different clearances. I do want to show, some people probably think this is a little extreme, but I can tell you I've done a lot of these, and when it comes to specifically getting the back two valves, the top intake and the bottom exhaust on both banks, doing it like this, unbolting the motor mounts and pulling the engine to one side or the other, is the difference between no visibility and very little visibility. So for me, it's definitely worth the extra time. I think I probably am a little bit faster doing it this way rather than trying to see in there with the mirror and fuss with that. So this is my preferred method. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the visibility. I mean, you can see there's a valve back there. It looks accessible here now, but once you slide your jig over here and you're in here trying to compress the spring and get another hand in there to get the keepers off, it gets really, really crowded really quickly. And it's much worse on this bank as well. You've got these heater hoses in here. I mean, that valve's pretty difficult to get a visual on. So I'm gonna go ahead and raise the engine up and pull it to the side. This is kind of a funky contraption, but this is what works. And if you pull it, you kind of use the tire as leverage, so you can slide the A-frame around the tire, and that'll in turn pull the engine to one side or the other. So I'm gonna do that now, and I'll show you the difference as far as visibility goes. So as you can see, it's not much, but it definitely raises the cylinder head up and gives you that little bit more clearance than you would have if you were to leave the engine sitting on the motor mounts. You can see the motor mount down there. It's not much. I mean, it's just barely above the stud, but For me, that's a big difference maker. I don't have necessarily small arms, so fitting my hands in there is maybe not as simple as it would be if I had little tiny hands or small arms, but for me this is pretty much a necessity. So now that I've got the engine pulled to the side, I'm going to go ahead and start doing the valve stem seals on the passenger side. Alright, I'm going to try and record this as best I can. I do have to have my hands in here, so it's kind of tricky to not block the camera and also not drop the keepers. But you can see I've got my air line connected. You can hear the air coming up from the bottom of the crankcase. That's totally normal. It's just whatever is blowing past the rings. I've got my setup on the first intake valve. So I'll go ahead and compress the intake valve. You can see there, you push down the spring, it exposes the keepers. I use a pocket screwdriver with a magnet on the end. If you have really any type of smaller magnet will work for this. But essentially, first things first, you need to make sure you have your air line connected. You can only do these 4 valves, so the 4 valves for that cylinder. If you go and compress a spring, pull the keepers off, and you didn't put that air line on there, you're going to have a really bad day. More than likely the valve is going to drop into the cylinder, and then you're going to end up having to take the cylinder head off. So connecting the air and paying attention to what valve spring you're on is absolute necessity. So let's go ahead and get this valve spring out of the way. You can see me compress that spring, go in here with my magnet, grab the first keeper, kind of wiggle it around, get the second keeper, and obviously you do not want to drop these in the engine. That would be definitely problematic and put you in a really bad spot. So just be really cautious with these. Don't have a fan on or anything in the background blowing. I have dropped these before. I have had them snag up on the hat of the spring and have them go launched flying across the room. Once you have the keepers off, you can just go in here and remove the valve spring with the top hat, set it inside. Obviously you want to put the same set of keepers and spring on the valve it came off of, so keep these in order. Don't flip-flop stuff around. Now you can see the valve stem seal is exposed. So there's your valve stem seal, one on each side. Your other intake valves over on this side. I use a tool specifically for this. It is made by Pro America. Never heard of that before, but that's who makes it. You can see it's got like little ribs on the jaw. These are specifically for removing valve stem seals. So you just go down here, get a grab on it, twist it, and there it goes. Pull it out just like that. You can throw that in the trash. And if you buy your valve stem seals from BMW or even some of the aftermarket companies, they're going to come with these little red sleeves. The purpose of these is you install them over the top of the valve stem seal before you put on the new seal, just so you don't happen to tear the seal or damage the seal when you're pushing it over the keeper grooves. So here's my new valve stem seal. I slide them on by hand, kind of push them down by hand, and then I'll take a 3/8 extension with a 16mm socket on the end of it, push it down over the top of it. And you can either push it down by hand, you can kind of feel a little bit of a affirmative click when you do that, but I always, it's kind of just habit, I always take a little hammer and just give them a little tap just to make sure they're seated. Once you do that, you can pull this sleeve off, and there you go. Your new seal is in place. Alright, so I realized I didn't record that first keeper install, but essentially what I use to install the keepers is I put a dab of assembly lube on the end of a pocket screwdriver, I don't know if I'll be able to get that to focus. You get the idea. I don't know if you can't see that. Just put a dab of assembly lube on the end of a pocket screwdriver. And then from there, your keepers are obviously tapered. You have a fat side and a skinny side. Skinny side goes down towards the valve. Fat side goes up. So what I do is I attach the keeper onto the tip of my pocket screwdriver like this. This is my preferred method of installing keepers. I install them one at a time. What I didn't record is I install that first one on the right hand side, and then I will take the tip of my pocket screwdriver and work it around to the back side of the valve. That way I still have good visibility when I go to install this second keeper, and I'm not trying to install it on the left hand side where I have, you know, the cylinder head and everything. Pretty much it's not accessible at all. So I've got my first keeper in there. You're going to want to take your pocket screwdriver, place your second keeper in place very carefully. There we go. You can see it's in place. Now when you let up the spring tension, you got to be extra careful to make sure the top hat of the spring doesn't catch on one of the keepers, because what will happen is if you're not paying attention and you relieve that tension and the keeper is caught on the top of the spring, which it does happen occasionally, that keeper will get shot across the room like a rocket and you will never find it. And then you'll be left wondering, did it fall in the engine? Do I need to find it? You know, can be kind of worrisome. So definitely just take your time with that. Obviously this is a very, very tedious process. 32 valves. These exhaust valves are even less visibility, so these are even more challenging. I mean, this is probably the easiest valve out of all of them, so that's why I chose to record it. But essentially the process is the same, just a little more difficult, but the process doesn't change. So I'm gonna go ahead and start working through all these valves and getting all the seals swapped out, and then I'll show you once that's completed, I'll show you how to put the engine back together and time the camshafts. Here's all my old valve stem seals removed from the car. Just for comparison, try and show you here. You can see just the diameter alone of the old versus the new. The new is much, much tighter. Not only that, these old ones, there we go. The new ones are nice and supple and have some give in the rubber. These old ones are brittle and they're just hard as a rock, really. So those are not going to be sealing up at all. Down to my last valve now. Save the best for last. Okay, so you take your intake cam and your Valvetronic assembly, your eccentric shaft, slide it down into place. Take your exhaust cam. Remember, we have the dots facing up, the dots on the intake cam and the dots on the exhaust cam both face up. Make sure all your cam caps are in the same exact place when you took them off. Alright, now once you've got both your intake and exhaust cam in, it doesn't really matter if the dots are pointing up just yet. We're not going to correct that until we go to put the Vanos gear on. So we're going to torque these in sequence inside to out to 10 Newton meters. Okay, now I've got my cams in. They're torqued down 10 Newton meters for all the cam nuts. I'm going to go ahead and take my little bungee off my timing chain. I'm going to put in my exhaust camshaft. You can tell this is the exhaust because right there it says AUS for aus, out. Just get it started here. Make sure you line it up. Boom, right there. Now I choose to leave my tensioners in place when I do these engines. If you follow the repair instructions, that's not what you're supposed to do, but that is what I do. That's what I've always done. So I will push on the chain here and pump the tensioner to give myself a little bit of give when I go to install my intake Vanos unit. You can see here's my intake. You can see there it says EIN on it right there. That stands for Ein intake. So I get this lined up. There's not much space. Now I gotta pump my tensioner. There you go. So if you push here, you can push on the chain, you can pump all the oil out of the tensioner to get the slack you need to put on your second Vanos unit, whether that's the intake or the exhaust, doesn't really matter. Ideally, you're supposed to remove the tensioners and install this little mechanical chain tensioning tool. I don't like to do that, so that's how I prefer to do it. I will snug these bolts up just by hand and just back them off just a little tiny bit, just enough so we can turn the camshaft freely without turning the Vanos unit. So now that I've got my Vanos units on here, I'll go ahead and install this upper chain guide with just the single bolt in it. You're going to need to take the bolt out, the banjo bolt for the oil rail off. Once you get that off, just put this guy in there, tighten it up. With that in place, we can go ahead and time the intake cam now. So I'm going to take my timing tool with the hole in it for the intake. I turn my dots up, facing up on my intake cam. Slide this bracket on. Make sure it's sitting flush on both sides. And then you have a tool that looks like this. And this will thread in the hole where the oil sprayer bolt goes. Can get it without. This is essentially going to hold the cam fixture in place when we go to torque the Vanos bolt. So you tighten that down, holds this block in place. Now you can go and torque your intake Vanos unit. The torque spec on this is 80 Newton meters. Use a pair of pliers or channel locks or whatever you want to use to turn the camshaft to a location where you can have the dots pointed up on the cam and get this block in place. Once it's in place and it's flat on both sides, you do the same thing you did on the intake side. Put this little tool on. Alright, so now what you're going to want to do is pull the pin out of your crankshaft, take these timing tools off, and turn the engine over for 2 full revolutions. After you're done doing that, on each bank you're going to want to check the timing of the intake and the exhaust camshaft. Another additional thing you're going to want to check is when you turn it over and you do your final check, you want to go through and check every single one of the Valvetronic springs to ensure they're clipped in where they're supposed to be. You can see that one there. It's resting in that little V channel on the eccentric lever. That spring needs to be right there on every single one. If one's popped off, you need to fix it. You need to get in there with a flathead screwdriver or a thick pick and lever it back up onto the lever, because if you don't, it's gonna misfire, it's gonna make a hell of a noise, and you're gonna have to get back into it to fix it. So always double check those, every single one. Make sure you check them. Once that's done and you checked your camshaft timing between your passenger and drivers and repinned your crank, made sure everything lines up, you can go ahead and throw this thing back together, and that's pretty much the entirety of the job. Like I was saying, this is a pretty complex job. I just kind of wanted to give a rough tutorial and walk you through the more difficult portion of this. So I hope you found it helpful. I think there's probably not too many people out there that are going to be trying to tackle this on their own, but if you do, hopefully you learned something from me, and this video was beneficial to you. So with that being said, I'll catch you guys next time.